Hello, everyone, and welcome back to yet another episode of Masters of Code, a video series wherein we talk to technologists about technologists, and everything else around it. I'm glad to have today Peeyush Ranjan with me. Peeyush is General Manager at Google Pay. Previously, he was at Flipkart as the CTO. Peeyush, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Alok. It's very nice to be here. And hi, everyone. I'm Peeyush. I currently work on Google Pay, which is a payment app which you might have used in India or other places. And I'm very happy to be here.
Great. So we are going to talk about today fintech and everything around fintech scaling and what does it take to build fintech. I'll just directly come to my first question, Piyush. In terms of mindset, in terms of resources, and fundamentally, what does it take to build fintech for scale? And when I say scale, I mean for like a billion plus people.
I think there are a lot of different things which it takes. The ones which come to the top of my mind, I think, is the mindset. The biggest revelation in fintech space, which we had when trying to build it for a billion plus people, is that we are many times used to building in high tech. We are used to building a product and say, okay, well, here's a product which a billion people need. And we figure out, take example of a messaging product or smartphones. Everybody in the world goes and uses it. But when we look inside fintech, it's actually not one product which all billion people use. And there are things which all of them will use, and then there are things which are fewer set and so on and so forth. There's almost a hierarchy of needs. The more economically developed you are, the more developed products are the ones which you want to use. That is one big thing which actually starts creating a kind of difference. The other big difference which we see is there are different rules. If you span countries, sometimes even if you span states, there are different rules which apply on money. It's like money is one of those things which the government actually has very strict regulations on how you can handle, and citizens are very happy that the government actually has those regulations. It protects them from fraud, it protects them from crime, there are money laundering laws, all sorts of things. And in this case, whenever you build a product, you have to be very aware of what exactly is the set of rules in which you have to go build it. And those set of rules can actually be different everywhere. It's almost like, you can see there are, a team of 11 players playing with a bat and a ball, but sometimes they're playing cricket, sometimes they're playing field hockey, sometimes they're playing baseball. It's not always the same rules. So you cannot say that you can just go and train a team of 11 people and have them play everything. So that billion user thing really breaks down into smaller things. And lastly, I will also say that there are cultural nuances also. In certain cultures, certain things are considered good, and in certain cultures, they are not. If you take United States, people love credit cards and they go use them for every payment, even if they can afford to pay. They love the rewards they get. And certain markets, like Germany, people look down upon using credit cards because they think it's a form of loan. And that kind of fundamental cultural difference also shows up in the products. So there's a lot which is there when you try to go to a billion people in terms of mindset, which of course has implications on resources. Many times you end up duplicating. It's hard to figure out what exactly can you make in common. You have to take care of specific cases. So there's a lot which happens over there.
All right, sure. Thanks for sharing that. And one of the reasons why I really wanted to ask this also is because if you see Indian startup scene, at least, right, there are the fintech is growing at a pace like never before, and it doesn't look like it's going to change for next decade or so. So it's even more relevant if you see funding, if you see growth, everything. And it's great that you mentioned about the cultural nuances, how different it is across the geography. So here, my question is around that only. If you can kind of take a deep dive in cultural nuances side of the things, and also how do you integrate that while building the product? Because cultural nuances is one thing, then understanding it and sort of integrating it. And it also means that there needs to be some room for experimentation while building. So how do you manage that while you're building and you know that you're going to launch the product for a good chunk of people? You're not going to launch it for like 100 or 1,000 people at sudden. In the beginning only, you're going to launch it for probably hundreds of thousands of people, if not more than that. So and especially here, it's about when you're building a global product versus when you're building a product for India. I mean, in India, given any consumer product, given the size of the consumer market, typically the product are built for Indian market as only. But if in case people are building for global, then how do people take care of these things?
Yeah, I can talk about the cultural aspect of how in India things were different compared to global. Even though things are they appear very different, fundamentally, many times things are similar, but you have to really build a product which attaches to the cultural sensitivities of the market. For example, at one point, to get people to really get excited about Google Pay in India, we built the Rangoli, Find the Rangoli Diwali game. If you were a GPay user at that time, you probably heard about it. That was a very cultural thing which we did. It is not something which we launched in any other country. But at the same time, we had a concept of cashback, which we started when we launched. We started with the concept of cashback. In a market like India, a lot of times we spend a lot of money in billboard advertising, newspaper top of the cover advertising, TV advertising. But we invested a lot of money in giving people cash back, teaching them how to use a digital payment product. And people love that. So sometimes it is like, you build something very close to the market, and sometimes you're trying to anticipate that, people will love this thing, even though there's no cashback kind of app yet in the market, right? So I think we experiment with, in one case, in the other case, it's a very clearly established thing, which we knew people love. Most of the country celebrates Diwali. People love viral games. Let's go build one, right? So we didn't have to think a lot there. On the cashback side, we had to actually experiment, try a lot, see what exactly works, what doesn't, and we had to invest a period of time to perfect, okay, this is how cashbacks should work. So it takes both kind of flavors depending on the feature.
Sure. Let's talk about slightly on the tech side of the things. While building for fintech, look, it's also very sensitive when it got, because your money is here concerned, right? So very sensitive. You have to take care of security aspect a lot. Also, as a team leader, right? You taking calls on, and this is not necessarily with just your experience, but you would have seen, as if you're mentoring a lot of startups and you have seen the growth journey of startups. While taking decisions on tech stack, right, or on security aspect of the things, because there's also a pressure on shipping fast, right, versus in terms of security, right, like how sure do you have to be, right? And then you'll say that of course you don't have to compromise on it, it's a big thing, but again there's a pressure of shipping fast, right? When you're growing at very fast pace, you cannot be this hey. So how do you kind of take those decisions when you're leading a team, when you are kind of telling people in terms of which tech stack to go for, how to take care of the security aspect and other technical aspects in terms of architecture and else?
Yeah, I think that the security aspect is very, very important. I think when you are building a fintech product, your biggest security or fraud problem will actually be bad actors in the ecosystem. So it's not just the tech stack which you feel like might get compromised, also is people who understand what the money flow is, and they will try to set things up in such a way that they can take money out of the system. So when you think about tech stack, I think that the primary choice of the tech stack, if I was making one, would be to choose a tech stack such that you can quickly go build something and learn fast about things you do not know, and not have a lot of upfront expense in platformizing and setting things up. The reason is because you don't know what problems exist out there. You will have theories, of course, of what problems exist out there, and you would like to build a product which matches those theories. But the most important thing is to learn whether you are right in your assumptions or not. And to learn that, you have to go build something, you have to bring it to the users, you have to see what they do. At that time, I would say invest in catching the bad actors. And as you get your product in front of more people, make sure that you have sufficient investment in understanding where the bad actors are coming from. It can almost be like a cat and mouse game. But that is the biggest consideration, I would say, in building a fintech product. The second thing I will say is that as you are scaling, like suppose you end up building something which users love, and now you start to see scale. That is when you will start to run into problems where other kind of challenges might start hitting your system. Also, because you have scaled, not only bad actors come, you also get in the the crosshairs of a lot of other hackers and others who are in the ecosystem. But as you scale and you see the system evolve, one of the things which we try to do is we try to keep the design simple so that you can scale more easily by quickly, adding more similar pieces of the things, like whether it's through sharding the system really well so that you can just scale by adding more hardware, by running more servers. But the idea is that the design has to be super simple so that the overall application continues to work as you scale. And now as you do that, as you can scale to user demand, then you start optimizing, you start looking at your security processes and make sure that everything is hardened really well. The one caveat to this, I will say, is what I read in a Jeff Bezos article was, one-way door versus two-way door, right? You make a certain decision and you have set your tech stack a certain way such that it's very hard to move away from it. That is going to be a problem. It's like you have to be very careful that if you're making a decision, how hard it is to reverse that decision. And the ones which are harder to undo versus easy to undo. And there's obviously a gradient of it. So it's not like a hard versus easy. The harder it is to undo, the more thoughtful one has to be about that particular choice in anything. Now, the counterpoint I will make to all this is like, once you have liftoff, suppose you get scale and you have that, even you have made mistakes early on, if you have built something which users like and you have kept your success above your failures, it's relatively easy to fix the problems once you have success, because it gives you more resources, it gives you more resilience, it attracts a lot of people who actually can want to come and help you become even more successful. So there is a lot of things which start going for you once you have liftoff. So I would say that first thing, try to learn fast as you can. Don't over platformize things. Second is scale. To scale as you see problems, keep your design simple, and be careful when keeping things very simple. That are you making irreversible decisions or reversible decisions? And lastly, you will have more room to fix things when you have liftoff. I've seen many teams many times feel like, oh my God, we have liftoff, our demand is growing even further, now we cannot fix anything. It's actually the opposite. Your demand is growing further. You can now invest some of your resources in fixing things while you continue to scale just by adding. So that's pretty much what I would say for tech stack and technical aspects of building.
So in this, just adding one more thing, because in our last question while answering, you mentioned about the regulation side of the things. What kind of complications are added when there are changes in regulations? Because look, this is also a domain wherein there's intervention in terms of from the government or the regulatory authorities, and it's a sensitive. So no matter at what scale are you operating, and then also like specific to the Indian market, there is a barrage of startups in, when you talk about lending, when you talk about payments, and it just keeps on this payments and the basically fintech solutions are gonna expand horizontal and vertical in both the sides. So sometimes it might get frustrating also as as a person working on the technology side of the things, that why do I have to take care? But what kind of complications do you think while you're operating at scale do come with the regulations or changes in regulations, and how do you kind of deal with those?
There are a lot of complications when you are in a regulated industry. Finance is one of them. Healthcare is another. And all these regulations are essentially designed to protect the end user. So once you realize that these are designed to protect the end user, and if your culture, just like, almost every company I have worked for has that culture of like, let's do what is right for the user. If you have that, then it becomes easy to feel like, why I have to go through this. I'll give you an example. Almost every country in which, if the money moves through your system, you need a money transmission license. Almost every country requires you to have that if the money moves through your system. When money moves through your system, you need a money transmission license, which means you need to watch for things like sanctions, things like money laundering issues. And then you need to report this back to the government saying that these things are going on. And when you have to report these back, well, this is very logical because the government has the ability and the authority to go and address these problems in society. And money is the way which is the lifeblood of a lot of activity. So you are sitting there, it's your responsibility to go do that. But once you think about it, you don't feel like, oh, why do I have to do it? Almost every time, it actually is when you haven't understood the point of view of where these regulations are coming from, what they are trying to achieve. The second thing, some of the countries have, like the finance has like a lot of regulations. I give you an example of one, which is very general and shows up in multiple countries. Banking license, these kind of things exist in multiple countries. If you hold other people's money, you need to have a license for it, right? So on and so forth. In some places, there are other regulations. Now, when the regulations come for the very first time, they actually do create a challenge for you, but not because those are not right, or not because they were like surprised, but it's because you are not ready. You have not done that. Like a very good example of that is at one point, all payments apps were expected to localize all transaction data and sensitive data to the geography within India's limits if they were operating on Indian accounts. Very reasonable, but global products are not designed to break up their databases and have them associated with geopolicies, if you will, right? The tech stack is not always designed that way. You cannot usually go buy off the shelf any kind of database which you can bring up, and then now you say, when I'm inserting this kind of record or that kind of record, this is the geolocation policy for these on a per record basis. There are times when there is issues that how do you run a join across these things, right? What happens to the derived data? Where does it sit if you've joined across two places which have different localization policies? So there are a lot of challenges like these, but we haven't solved those in the past because the apps which we used to make, they used to be all global. Our websites used to generally be global in nature. But now, as we get into regulated spaces and people are understanding that technology is getting deeper into people's lives, it's running more into the policies which it needs to adhere with. And now we have to go build the solutions. And that's what we did in India, for example, right? GPay India, all the data sits in India in Google's data centers and every user, but that's because that was the policy. And we didn't have that capability before, but when that policy came up, we went and implemented that because that is what that application needed. So, we kind of like understand why this policy is needed and then go do it because it's all in the service of the user.
Got it. Uh, yeah. So next question is around challenges, and I know that in our last answers we have discussed in bits and pieces about the challenges in this space. But if you have to kind of consolidate and talk about it, then what are some of the top challenges uh, which you have faced, or one faces in while building in this domain, fintech? And it can be across, like I said, it could be in lending, it could be in payments, it could be in infrastructure side of the things, whatever people are building. So what are some of the top challenges, and especially as a techie, right, as a technology leader?
Um, I think that the biggest challenge as a technology leader, actually technology and product, I will tell you both sides, because even if you're in a startup, you have to kind of think of both of them. And if you're running a large product also, you have to kind of think of both of them. Going back all the way, while every market looks similar, everybody in the world deals with money. But when you get closer into the market, when you get closer into a segment of strata, economic strata, what people need, what people deal with is very different compared to others, or maybe it's different enough compared to what others do. This understanding how to do this is actually a big challenge which we have faced, because just like I gave the example of regulations, our culture has been almost throughout that build a site, a service, a product which anybody in the world can go use, right? Sometimes the fact that it's limited to a country is more limited by the content of that application. You could build a local video streaming app, but it's local only because that content is local, right? You could take that app and put content on it from other countries, and then you can see it in other places. So it becomes more about the content, but functionality tends to be global. But when we started building fintech app, it became very clear the functionality is not necessarily global. How you pay your bills in, say, India is very different from how you pay your bills in, say, Japan, or how you pay your bills in America. But while it appears that people are paying bills, the process, the technology, the tech stack, the experience, everything is very different. The fact that you can actually go anywhere and majority of the users can tap their phones using credit cards onto a merchant's terminal is something which is only possible if that particular market has a lot of NFC enabled phones, has a lot of people running around with credit cards or debit cards in their pocket, a lot of merchants with point of sale terminal, which actually is NFC capable. And networks like Visa and MasterCard have acquired them into the network. So if you have all this set up, now all of a sudden it's much easier for you to go tap everywhere, which is the state United States is in. And then there are markets in which people are not doing that, and they're mostly being cash heavy. And now you come with a digital cash equivalent solution, and now people start using that instead, right? So you have to kind of understand. This understanding is very important. Now, when you go up a level, in certain markets, you can give credit very easily because you have enough data to determine risk. In certain markets, you cannot give credit very easily. In certain markets, giving credit is highly regulated. So you have to know what rules apply and who can make credit decisions and who cannot. And certain markets, credit might not be regulated, but is highly looked down upon. So even if you built a great product, nobody wants to borrow because they don't like credit as a cultural thing. So there are all of these nuances we have to understand. Now imagine that all of these exist and we figure out that, yes, we know exactly 20 markets, billions of people, we know what to build for each of these 20. Now think as a techie, and you will realize how big a problem this is. Because are you going to build 20 applications? Or are you going to build one? And if you're going to build one, now you have a question. How do you address these 20 different use cases without really that one app being all 20 in one, right? So how do you create efficiency? How do you remove duplication? How much do you platformize versus how much do you create specific stuff? And by the way, imagine if you went through and you did a good job of creating one app with a tech stack, with the right layer at which you have all the platform boundaries, all the general purpose architecture, and then plugins for every market, and everything is working. That is great. But now the problem is, how do you evolve? Because each of these markets will evolve at different rates. How do you make sure that you are not left behind when you are working in a particular market? Some new technology comes in a market, some new regulation comes in a market. Well, that app, how do you make sure it actually evolves fast enough? Because the way you had thought through, maybe it has ramifications all the way down the stack. And now it became hard for you because you brought everything together. If you had everything separate, you could have moved really fast. But if you had moved really fast, you would have 20 different apps in 20 different markets. Now, these kind of problems are not seen in, like, if you were building the example I gave with the video application, if it's all about content, it doesn't matter. You can launch the same app in 20 countries and you can have 20 different video, sets of video files, which you can put on CDN and get them to play. But that's not the thing. Like, most of the time, people, when they interact with video, it's almost similar behavior, it's not regulated and all that, apart from the content. Most of the content is where that challenge shows up. But technology-wise, this creates a big problem for us. So that is another example. I already talked about another top challenge, which is like a part of our stack. We think everything is working, and now there is a particular new requirement that one sliver of that data has to sit in a particular geography. And the database doesn't understand this concept of policy of a geography. The upper layers of the system don't understand this policy for geography. And now you keep pulling this problem up, and now everybody has to understand, when is it that the data has to store here? When is it doesn't? When the data moves anywhere for any purpose, what kind of lifetime can it have? And all that, so that we are always in a good compliant state. So we had to kind of go through all of that. It took, like, amazing engineers a lot of time to go and refactor everything and make it work.
Sure, that's quite an elaborate answer. And I'm happy you shared it this way. A very natural flow of question next is about slightly interesting side. That's the mistakes, right? What are some of the common and not so common mistakes which you think people make while building? And you would have seen here, I'm talking about a lot of relatively younger companies as well. You would have seen in the journey, either the companies you mentored or you would have just noticed around, and as a part of your journey yourself, right? So what are some of the mistakes, common and not so common, which uh, people make while building products in the fintech domain?
I don't know about the fintech domain. I can tell you the mistakes which people generally make. I will probably only be able to talk about the mistakes I make. The list is so long that I think we will run over all the time we have. But let me give you some examples of some mistakes which I have made and learned from enough that I feel like not making them was attributable to, things getting better. One of the earliest lessons I learned was never add more resources to a problem than it needs. Sometimes we see a big problem in front of us and we say, all right, let's everybody go work on it. It only makes it harder to solve. If the problem is ambiguous, if you cannot break it down, what ends up happening is that people have to figure out how exactly to tackle the problem. How do you break it apart? What kind of system do you need to build? Who's the user you are going after? What are the tech choices you're going to make? How will you run the various processes for release, for support, for bug? All of these. If you have a lot of people, it will take way longer for the solution to come about. It's almost, I think it's almost like an art for a team to figure out when is it that they need more people working on it. And there's a temptation that, oh, this looks like a hard problem, let's have more people working on it. And I think that is the first thing which I learned, is never add more people to a problem than it can bear. Obviously, it seems philosophical that don't add more people to a problem than it can bear, but it is actually very interesting. I have had failures. One of my favorite projects when I was at Google, when I used to work in search, we ended up shutting down because we had too many good people working on it, and it never saw the light of the day. The other interesting problem, which I later turned into a mantra, was what ends up happening is that many times, and I'm sure it has happened to the audience, is like you're working on something, then somebody else comes up with another creative thing, which you're like, oh yeah, we should add this also in it. Sometimes you're working on something and then you see a competition, you suddenly discovered another company is doing the same thing. Now you're trying to figure out, how else we differentiate. You got to add something else. Sometimes a user gave a feedback, should we do this? We haven't released the product yet. So there's a lot of this happens. And things get complex. There's a deadline of launch, there's pressure on your head. How can we get this done? And one of the things is, whenever you change direction before launch, always makes things simpler and more elegant. Do not add more. Actually, one of my most classic experiences for this was when I was in Flipkart and we were doing the big billion day, and we were trying to make sure that we hit our scale limits and we have a successful big billion day. I think it was in 2015. And I remember, because we wanted a big sale as well, and there were so many asks. And my biggest thing was, we got to have a sale which works through perfectly. And that was the one lesson which clearly came to mind. I said no to so many people when it came should we do this? Can we do this? I'm like, no. If we are changing direction before launch, it only has to be simpler and more elegant. It cannot be more complex. There is always enough complexity which you do not know, which will come and bite you in your ankle. You got to be simplifying and making sure that things are working. I mean, keep it simple, but not any simpler. But the thing is that still resist the temptation to add more, because you don't know, or you are underestimating what it'll take to go through the entire process and make it successful. So this is one of the things I tell people, like when you're trying to launch something, when you're trying to push something out, please do not add things to it. If you're changing direction, change it towards something simpler and more elegant. That has been, and it's very hard to do, by the way. It works opposite of a builder's brain, that, oh, let me make things more simple. Sometimes it has been an interesting challenge. You feel, we are designed, especially in the day of cloud and everything, we are wired to think N+2, redundancy, why have, when you have more servers doing the same thing, if two go down, then it doesn't matter. And that is a very good pattern to go after. But I have seen sometimes by leveraging things where you think you are going after, you are creating multiple solutions, you actually, you are creating diversity and redundancy, you end up creating more risk in the system as opposed to de-risking. If you had just one thing, you can fix it top to bottom without a problem. But if you said, imagine if you had just one location where you were doing everything, you could fix it top to bottom without a problem if the data center was flooded, let's say, for some reason, right? But if you had 4 different cities, where you had 4 different data centers, and you could not live with a data center, if your design was not good, if it was stateful in a way that you actually need, now the chance of you being hit by a flood has now gone up 4x. And flooding is not the example, but the real issue here is when you fragment and you think, well, I'll store data in multiple places, you might actually be signing up for a problem if you don't understand, what is the risks in each of these environments and what is the redundancy in each of these environments. The times you fall victim to such a thing is when you assume that everything is fungible. Hey, I'm running 4 servers and they are all fungible, but turns out they are not. You actually need 2 of them to always be running because some job was there or something, some dependencies there, and now all of a sudden you have created more risk in the system. It's again, it doesn't mean that you don't have a redundancy. It just means it's not a panacea. It's sometimes you end up signing up for a problem instead, which was one of the lessons which we had in multiple projects where we had multiple dependencies. We thought they were all equivalent. let's say you have payment processors, right? Think all of them are equivalent, but they're not. And now one of them gets compromised. Well, some of your traffic got compromised, right? So the other thing, the couple of product learnings also we have had. I think maybe I'll just share these. These are challenges, but they always turn into lessons. I realized of all the things, a lot of the product or the app or the web or the API or anything you build, the workflow the user is trained to do is actually surprisingly important. Training a user to go do something else is non-trivial when you try to train them. Now, if they have never done something before, then it's a different thing. But training them to go do something else is non-trivial, right? When YouTube came out initially, you saw this, there was a triangle on it, which was a play sign, right? But it was because it was to train people that this will play the video, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't know that is it a video or is it an image? Because people are not trained to watch videos on the internet, but they were trained on the VCR and the DVD to see that button and press it, right? So you have to leverage their training to go and bring them into a new place, right? You see save icon, many places are floppy. I bet people who are using that, they're 50% or 70% of them have never seen a floppy in their life. But it was the training which went all the way through. So the amount of emphasis on the user's workflow is so high. This is why when people get used to a product, it is very hard for them to switch. That is one product base. So if you are trying to build something, think about the user's workflow. Think your customers. What do they really do? And figure out how can you get in there and make that journey better. If you have to retrain them to go do something else, you have a big hump you have to go over. It doesn't mean you cannot. People learn driving, right? They don't know driving before, and they eventually do. But the reason is because the value on the other side is so high, and you'll have to then establish that value. They'll have to see it, even maybe experience it without the training, then they can go do it. But a much easier thing which I learned was if you can get into the people's workflow and you can actually figure out how to train them without retraining them. How do you do this? And a last one I'll say is network effects. A lot of people probably know that. Network effects, they're hard to build. They're equally hard to counter. Even if you have a better product, the network itself is part of the product. So it's not trivial to break a network effect. If you are, an entrepreneur today, you're trying to do that, do not underestimate the power of the network effect. There are ways you can build your own network, but do not underestimate the power of network effect and how it concentrates power in such a way that it becomes hard for others to, build a better product. So that is another challenge which we see. I think that's probably enough. The list could go on, and we'll be out of time.
This is good and very insightful. I'll say that you shared your own experience in terms of these mistakes and learnings. All right, moving on to the last question of a conversation, and this is around. Look, Peeyush, you have been a part of, I believe, two of the organizations which are looked up to by techies in terms of their culture, in terms of what they have done, not only from the product side of the things, but also in terms of the culture and other aspects. So I want to know that if I have to ask that, in your opinion, what are some of the things which today's startups can learn, especially the tech teams, and pick from these cultures or in terms of decision-making frameworks, so that because these are the companies where you have been a part of, they have grown pretty fast, they have maintained respect in the technology community, right, and they have been still an inspiration for many. So how, what are some of those things which tech teams of the startups today should be learning and picking?
I have been very, very lucky to observe two amazing companies, actually three if you count Airbnb in it, Google and Flipkart and Airbnb from inside and see what makes them tick and what makes them so successful. So I will say maybe I'll give 3 things. Okay. I think these 3 things matter in every company, irrespective of the size. But there's a survivor bias. I doubt that the companies today which are highly successful, which don't do these 3 things. Number 1, I will say, is the obsession with the customer. You have to know who you are building for, right? Who is the person you're building for, and obsess on it. You have to keep a very clear, and it requires a clarity of mind, because there are times when you will see that things are not necessarily always right for the user, but you end up doing, because the decision makers, when you break the problem down, have different incentives in different places. It's never a matter of malice, it's just a matter of perspective. I can give you an example. There was a time when we were trying to figure out that for a particular query, when I used to work in search, whether it was Harry Potter or something else, I forget what it was, should we show ads? There were not many good ads, but a lot of people were searching for Harry Potter. The question was, should we show ads which are not that good? You could say, well, not that good, but still better than nothing. Like, why not just show that? It's not like you are, showing them, and it was not spammy. It was just like, okay, like you are searching for the latest version of Harry Potter and showing you the ad for the previous book, let's say, right? The decision, if you're obsessed about the customer, is to not show anything, because you'll say that's what the user is looking for. Why would you want to show it? We did not show anything. The net result was every other ad got higher clicks. The reason is, when you actually treat customer with respect and you say, hey, there's nothing good to show here, it decreases ad blindness. When you show something, it's actually information. And then the person goes and clicks on it because it's information. They know that when you show it, it's actually going to be information. When you don't show it, it means there's nothing to see there. So net result is focus on the customer helped us, right? And this is just one example. And in every company, I have seen this in Flipkart, I've seen this in Airbnb, I've seen this in Google. Obsess about the customer, understand who is it you are building for, and every decision, make sure that you are actually keeping them first. There is, I've never worked at Amazon, but there is a urban legend that in their board meeting, there's always an empty chair to represent the customer. But I mean, the thing is, you can do that in your mind. Like you can say, okay, well, what exactly is in it for the customer? Sometimes you'll see there are partners of yours, there are users of yours, and now you have to make a decision where you might help the partner but not the user. And the thing is, like, you got to make these tough decisions, and that is the mantra I would say I've seen every one of them follow. If you're a small company, still focusing on the customer is absolutely something which I will not say. The second thing which I found in these companies, and I've seen companies which have failed when they did not do this, teams over individuals. I felt like we have, great engineers, product managers, designers, salespeople everywhere in every company. I felt like all of these 3 really, while they were like, stars in every one of them, teams over individuals was very, very, core part of the culture. The problem in front of it had a bunch of team coming together and solving it. And it was a lot less a person said so, and a lot of people fell in the line and just went and did it. Which, by the way, is non-trivial, because sometimes people will just follow the founder, if you will, right? And you have to, and it's only possible, this culture is only possible, this kind of like teams over individuals, is if the most powerful individual creates such a culture. Otherwise, it will self-select into people who will just do what you say, and the people who do not like it will then slowly find themselves out of the organization. So that is one. The other very subtle thing which is teams over individuals is don't serialize, especially if you're in high tech. It might be true in other parts of the industry where things might be less ambiguous. But if things are ambiguous, if you are on the frontier of innovation, do not serialize. What I mean by do not serialize is don't have the user talk to a user researcher, talk to a product manager, and talk to an engineer, and then the engineer builds something and put it in there, and that goes out there, and somebody else looks at the business metrics. Instead of having a pipeline, have a round table. Let the people understand what's going on. The reason it is because it's an ambiguous problem. Nobody knows the answer. If people knew the answer, then yes, have a pipeline. But if nobody knows the answer, then do it this way. Even if people know the answer, have an escalation mechanism, because you never know what issues will happen at the other end of the pipeline, and have a way that everybody has to pay attention, almost like the Kanban thing in Toyota, which was like, everybody was building, but anybody saw a problem could pull that, and now everybody would get together and solve the problem, right? So teams are what matters. Don't serialize. That is the second thing which I have seen as a consistent theme across. And last, which I'll say is, and maybe it's connected to the second one. I'll tell you in which way it is connected. Treat your employees really well. This is probably going again for the founding team and the management. It's like, they are your biggest asset, right? It's like, I many times give example, which hits more viscerally to people. It's like, think of any startup, any high-tech company as a hospital. And sure, you can be the you can be the founder, and you can be the leader in the top floor, but really you're still a hospital manager, you're still an administrator. The actual set of people who come together and treat a patient and perform a surgery is not you. If you're doing that, then great, then you're not the person who's running the hospital, because then you have given up that job, right? If you're doing this, that means you have to empower people so that they can come together. You have to create a culture where everybody brings their best, and they're bringing their brain and performing on the problem. That is exactly what happens in software industry as well. People bring their strengths, they look at the problem, that's the round table example I was giving, and then they work together, which means if that is the case, then what is your biggest asset? It is these people who are coming together and working. Each of these companies, and if you're in India, you already see the way Flipkart treats its employees. Google has been known for ages to be one of the best places to work, and so is Airbnb, very highly rated. So I think that all of them treat their employees really well. They think of them as their biggest assets. That is the group which helps them go solve the problems which they've set out to solve. So I would say those are the three things: obsess about the customer, teams over individuals, and treat your people really well.
All right. I think thanks so much for that, Peeyush, and thanks for the entire conversation. I hope it was as insightful for everyone as it was for me. Really glad to have you. Hope you had a good time.
It was great. Thank you for having me. I actually really enjoyed, and it always makes me relive a lot of the other experience I've had, and I'm very happy to share what I could. Thank you.
All right, that's it, folks. Then I'm your host, Alok Soni, and I'll catch up in the next episode of Masters of Code. We just had Peeyush Ranjan, General Manager at Google Pay, with us, talk about FinTech, 4 billion plus, and all the challenges and things around it. Thanks so much again.